Thank you very much, Secretary General. Your Excellency, Mr. Abdel El Assisi, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt. His Excellency, Mr. Azali Assoumani, President of the Union of Comoros and the Chairperson of the African Union. Your Excellency, Emerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa, President of the Republic of Zimbabwe. His Excellency, Philip Isdo Mpango, the Vice President of the United Republic of Tanzania, representing Her Excellency Samia Suluhu Hassan, President of the United Republic of Tanzania. The Right Honorable Edward Ingerente, the Prime Minister of the Republic of Rwanda, representing His Excellency Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda. His Excellency Gaves Indirakobuka, Prime Minister of the Republic of Burundi, representing His Excellency Evariste Ndayishimiye, President of the Republic of Burundi. His Excellency Hamze Abdi Barre, the Prime Minister of the Federal Republic of Somalia, representing His Excellency Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud, the President of the Federal Republic of Somalia. His Excellency, my dear brother, Moussa Faki Mohammed, the Chairperson of the African Union Commission. His Excellency Mustafa Madbouli, the Prime Minister of the Arab Republic of Egypt. Honorable Hassan Abdallah, Acting Governor of the Central Bank of the Arab Republic of Egypt, and of course, the Chairperson of the Board of Governors of the African Development Bank. And by the way, just as the Secretary General said, he and his team and those in foreign affairs, all the ministries, they've done a fantastic job. Thank you very much, Mr. Governor. Your Excellency, Staff Major General Khaled Fuda, the Governor of the South Senior Governorate, Honorable Governors of the African Development Bank Group, His Excellency Dr. Sultan Ahmed Al-Jabbar, the Minister of Industry and Advanced Technology of the United Arab Emirates and UAE Special Envoy for Climate Change and COP28 President-designate, alternative governors of the African Development Bank Group, senior officials of the Arab Republic of Egypt, Mr. Omar Kabaj, the former president of the African Development Bank Group, heads of regional economic communities and financial institutions, members of the diplomatic corps, executive directors of the African Development Bank Group, my own senior management and staff of the bank, media houses, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2023 annual meetings of the African Development Bank Group with the theme, Mobilizing Private Sector Financing for Climate and Green Growth in Africa. I wish to start by thanking His Excellency President Al-Sisi, my very dear big brother and also friend, for hosting so generously the 2023 annual meetings of the African Development Bank Group. I applaud and I am grateful, Your Excellency, for the excellent support of the government of Egypt in preparing for these annual meetings. Thank you very much, sir. A special welcome to you, the heads of state and government, for being here for these annual meetings. Thank you for honoring our invitation. Your presence in such large numbers is a testament of the great friendship you have, of course, with Egypt, and the support that you have always been given to the African Development Bank. A special welcome to President Azali Assoumani of the Union of Comoros and the Chairperson of the African Union, Chairman of the African Union, and President Emerson Mnangagwa of the Republic of Zimbabwe. We are delighted as well to be joined by Vice President Philip Mpango of the United Republic of Tanzania, Prime Minister Hamze Barre of the Federal Republic of Somalia, Prime Minister Edward Ingerente of the Republic of Rwanda, Prime Minister Gaves Indira Kubuka of the Republic of Burundi, and my dear big brother, His Excellency, former President Joachim Chissano, the former President of the Republic of Mozambique. A special welcome to you, my dear brother, Your Excellency Moussa Faki, the Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Thank you for your strong partnership with the African Development Bank and for your support. Thank you very much for all we do together. I'd like to give a warm welcome to all our governors of the bank, honorable ministers, and all participants to these annual meetings. We are particularly delighted to have two special guests, His Excellency Omar Kabaj, the former president of the African Development Bank Group, and His Excellency Dr. Sultan Ahmed Al-Jabbar, UAE Special Envoy for Climate and COP28 President-designate. And just so that you know, I was talking to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Egypt, my dear brother, and he was telling me he can't wait to turn off this to you for COP28. So let's give it up to the Minister Shukri of the Arab Republic of Egypt. He did a fantastic job globally for us on COP27, and we are going to COP28. Thank you very much, brother. Of course, a very special welcome to my own loving and darling wife, Grace. Thanks, honey, for being here. You are my greatest supporter. Welcome to the beautiful city of Sharm el-Sheikh, a modern city being managed exceptionally well. The governor of South Sinai, Major General retired Khaled Fouda, and his team are doing an incredible job, making Egypt and Africa very proud. And Your Excellency, Mr. President, you should be very proud of them. I came to this place, I saw them, the way they pay attention to detail. It should make you proud, it makes us proud. Thank you very much. Sharm el-Sheikh brings back some great memories for us. It was right here that the world met for COP27, the place where the world again renewed its commitment to keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was right here, under the excellent leadership of President El-Sisi, that the world made the historic decision on loss and damage on climate change. Loss and damage? Yes. African countries, which accounted for only 3% of the cumulative carbon emissions globally, now suffer disproportionately from its negative consequences. Right here in Egypt, water security has become a national issue. At COP27, Egypt launched the Nexus on Water, Food, and Energy, a very bold effort to mobilize $14 billion to tackle the effects of climate change. The African Development Bank is leading this effort to mobilize $1.4 billion to support desalination and water treatment plants for agriculture. Your Excellency, Mr. President, I'm delighted to let you know today that we have actually exceeded that target. With all our partners, we've mobilized $2.2 billion from development partners to advance your mission on this. Across the Sahel, hotter climate is drying up water basins. The Lake Chad Basin, which used to support livelihoods of millions of people in Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, has shrunk to 1/10 of its size. In several parts of the Horn of Africa, rains have not fallen for over 4 seasons. And in Malawi, Mozambique, Madagascar, Zambia, and Rwanda, cyclones and floods have left devastation in their wake. For the loss of lives and destruction of a lot of infrastructure, and for the small island states are buffeted by rising sea levels, coastal erosion, of course, significant losses. Whichever way you look at it, Africa is being devastated by climate change. It loses $7 to $15 billion a year due to climate change, which is projected to rise to $50 billion by 2030. finding the financial resources to tackle climate change is increasingly difficult for African countries that are still reeling from the effects of COVID-19 pandemic, now exacerbated by climate change, debt, and inflation arising from the mixture of global geopolitical conflicts and the high global inflationary trends. Africa's cumulative climate financing needs are estimated at $2.7 trillion between 2020 and 2030. Climate adaptation costs are estimated between $249 to $407 billion over the same period. Yet, climate financing resources are only flowing to Africa in trickles. As the continent receives only a mere 3% of global climate finance, of which 14% is from the private sector, the lowest, I must say, in the world. So there's much to do to leverage private sector into climate finance and green growth. Your bank, the African Development Bank, is playing its part. We have exceeded our commitment to provide 40% of our total financing to climate, reaching 45% in 2022. We committed 63% of our total climate finance to adaptation, exceeding the global target of 50%. And in the bank, the praise from the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the United Nations General Assembly as a global leader on climate adaptation. I think we should clap for the African Development Bank. And we'll continue to do more. To do more, we launched the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, together with the Global Center on Adaptation, to mobilize $25 billion for climate adaptation. Now, while developed countries must meet their commitments to provide $100 billion annually to developing countries for climate finance, this is still, even though a good gesture, minuscule compared to financing needs. Public climate financing must be complemented by mobilization of resources from the private sector. To mobilize more private sector climate financing for Africa, we launched the African Financial Alliance for Climate to bring together all financial institutions, stock exchanges in Africa, to green the financial ecosystem. Financial institutions should incorporate climate financing into all their operations. The valuation of companies on the stock exchanges based on the greening of their portfolios will provide greater incentives for green investment across Africa. The use of green bonds can mobilize global green financing to Africa. And that is because Africa currently accounts for just 0.2% of the $2.2 trillion of cumulative green bonds issued up to 2022. The African Development Bank has issued more than $10 billion of green and social bonds in the past 10 years. It has allowed us to support green projects, such as the Kabeoluka wind farm in Cabo Verde, which supplies about 20% of its electricity. And right here in Egypt, the Gabal El Asfar water treatment plant, which supplies water for over 3.3 million people, one of the 10 largest water treatment plants in the world. And when I came here to see His Excellency President al-Sisi, and I mentioned this to him, he said to me, look, we are working on probably about 3 or 4 other water treatment plants. And it happens to be even bigger than what I've just said today. And I'm quite pleased that right here in Egypt, Mr. President, you take bold decisions, and one thing that I admire about you, make them happen very fast and at scale. I think by the time you look at all of what is being done, it's amazing that how fast change can happen. Thank you, sir. We are using the private sector to transfer to the market the climate risks facing countries by insuring countries against climatic shocks. The Africa Disaster Risk Financing Program, which is being implemented in partnership with the African Risk Capacity, now supports African countries in managing risks of climate disasters through risk profiling, contingency planning, and disaster risk financing. Your Excellencies, it is working and working very well. 3 years ago, when Madagascar suffered from droughts, the program disbursed $2.1 billion to support losses suffered by 600,000 vulnerable people. Similarly, when Malawi experienced droughts, the insurance program unlocked $14.2 billion of payout to farmers. The bank is now working to deepen the development of reinsurance markets to expand the capacity of the private sector on market risk transfers. Your Excellencies, we must do more to green the infrastructure space of Africa through private sector financing. And that's why the African Development Bank, Africa 50, and partners launched the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, which we call AGIA. It will accelerate private sector investments in renewable energy, green urban infrastructure systems, green hydrogen, and climate-resilient infrastructure. AGIA hopes to mobilize $500 million of project preparation and project development financing using private equity platforms, and to mobilize $10 billion of private sector financing for green infrastructure in Africa. The African Development Bank is also using blended financing to accelerate private investment in electricity. We are implementing, with public and private sectors, a $20 billion desert-to-power program to develop 10,000 megawatts of electricity using solar in the Sahel and provide electricity for 250 million people. And when it is done, it's going to be the largest solar zone in the world. And Mr. President, we are particularly also pleased as a bank to have been part of supporting you for the Ben Ban project that you have here, which is also a great solar program. The bank is deploying private partial credit guarantees to support the mobilization of private financing. A good example is our recent provision of 195 million euros as partial credit guarantee to support the Republic of Benin to raise $500 million on global capital markets. And last week, our board of directors approved a $345 million partial credit guarantee to support Egypt to raise $500 million in private financing for green growth through its issuance of its first ever sustainability panda bond, which I must say is also the first in Africa. As the world moves to transition to electric cars and vehicles, Africa, Your Excellencies, stands to be able to attract billions of dollars in private investment for greening global transport systems. That's because Africa has 80% of the global deposits of platinum, 50% of the global deposit of cobalt, 40% of nickel, and substantial deposits of lithium. Africa must not make the same mistakes of the past. Africa must set itself up to manufacture lithium-ion batteries to tap into the future markets of electric vehicles that some projections estimate will run into several trillions of dollars in future. I must say here that the cost of establishing a lithium-ion precursor factory in Africa is 3 times less expensive than in China and 3 times less expensive than in the United States. The future before us is full of challenges on climate change, no doubt. But it also has and holds massive opportunities on green growth for our economies. To mobilize a lot more private financing for climate change and green growth, governments and development partners should take 5 approaches. First, establish national development plans for green transition for their economies. Second, subsidize green industries to spur growth, raise demand, profitability, and sustainability. Third, multilateral and bilateral financial institutions should provide guarantees at scale to help de-risk investments by the private sector. Fourth, support should be provided for the preparation and development of bankable projects that can provide high risk-adjusted returns to the private sector. And fifth, existing public finance infrastructure should be transferred to the private sector, what we are collectively calling, working with Africa 50, asset recycling, to mobilize more private sector resources for greener infrastructure. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, over the next 3 days of these annual meetings, we will discuss and explore these and other big ideas as we move to climate-proof Africa and boost green growth. The future of Africa is green. Our sun, wind, geothermal, and water should power our continent. Our infrastructure should be green and greener. Our economies must be climate-proofed and resilient. Let's unleash the power of the private sector for a greener Africa. Welcome once again. Thank you very much. Shukran.
Thank you, Mr. President, for such a powerful speech, which clearly sets the tone for these annual meetings. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, it is my honor to call upon His Excellency Moussa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission, to deliver his statement.
In
the name of God, most merciful, most benevolent, Excellency, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt, His Excellency Mr. Azali Assoumani, President of the Union of the Comoros and current Chairperson of the African Union, Excellencies, Heads of States and Governments, Excellency, President of the African Development Bank Group, dear brother, Dr. Adesina, Excellencies, Ministers of Finance, Excellencies, Governors of Central Banks, ladies and gentlemen. Humans, not unlike animals, tend to seek the reassurance of safe and resource-rich abodes. Today, we indeed embody this natural rule as we reconvene back here in the city of peace, Sharm el-Sheikh, after we partook in the celebrations of climate at COP27. Today, we find ourselves once again in Sharm el-Sheikh to bridge the gap of finance at a time when the president of Egypt is leading the African Union Development Agency and is also spearheading the project for investment in infrastructure and energy transformation in Africa. May God bless the soul of Naguib Mahfouz. Had he been alive, he would have drawn inspiration from this unique intersection of time and space and would have certainly penned a new novel about it.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's with great joy that I have responded to the invitation of the President of the African Development Group, my friend, brother, Dr. Adesina, who has honored me to associate me to this important event, which is the annual meetings of the ADB and the meetings of the governors of central banks. Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, I want to thank you for this kind consideration and care which has compelled me to leave the headquarters of the African Union on the eve of the celebration of the 60th anniversary of the OAU. My stay in Sharm el-Sheikh, in this marvelous pearl lapped by the waters of the Red Sea, because of its position at the foot of the mythical Sinai Mountains, will in fact be lasting. In fact, I want to greet the people and the government of Egypt for the warm welcome, which also is feeding on the legendary hospitality of Sharm el-Sheikh. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the theme of the general meetings focus on the financing of climate change and blue economy, which is only a part of the major needs for the financing of Africa, which has been clearly stated and laid down in Monterrey in 2002, and this obviously has been recurring. Doha in 2008, Dhaka in 2023, going through Addis Ababa in 2015, and Paris in 2021. The issue has become a fashion. With a fashion, in fact, they come in waves and is anticipated in time. Is it not high time that we ask ourselves the simple and fatal question, what have we done with all the decisions that we have adopted in all these fora? What do the indicators that we see in African economies tell us? And the debt which is ever rising. What is the result? That is the low attractiveness of external funding. What, in fact, can we do about the mobilizing domestic at the national level? And then experts are telling us that it is stagnating if it is not regressing. Mr. Chairman, I think that maybe the questions I'm raising are a bit bitter and maybe sarcastic, but this is not to be discouraged or to be pessimistic. I simply want to express here in Sharm el-Sheikh the ardent wish that this conference not be just another conference on financing, which is always deferred for Africa. I believe that the financing should be an endogenous process, as Agenda 2063 is stating. That is, Africa should find its capacity to become relatively autonomous and to ensure the financing of its own development. As I'm not an expert in these technical issues, however, I cannot help express my reservations on the limitations of the financing of development, just limiting it to monetary and aspects. I'm wondering whether we should not look at realities in the eyes in order to look at it holistically. That is, the outcome of the reforms, the institutional reforms, and which, in fact, should be in the medium and long term. When pending the attainment of this objective, Africa and its different partners are urged to pool their efforts in order to have collective effort in order to improve attractiveness and effectiveness of external financing. On this issue, to this end, it is necessary that we evaluate the various donor-beneficiary financing model, and also to stress the limitations and propose alternatives that could be adjusted to the logic of a partnership, a win-win partnership. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I want to refer now to the theme of this general meeting, that is the financing of climate change and green growth. I want to first congratulate the president of the group, Dr. Asina, for choosing this theme, which, as I said earlier on, which is a burning issue, and which obviously with the effects of climate change, which have been devastating Africa, particularly on the continent. Since 1970, Africa has been affected by floods and drought recurrently and successively. And this has led to 0.4 or 0.7% of the GDP. And as you're aware, that the needs for financing of Africa, which is linked to adaptation to climate change and also to its mitigation, we need to know that this will be on the increase. The consequence is that there is need to find appropriate financing in order to implement the African Common Position, which is presented and debated at the recent negotiations of COP27 here in Sharm el-Sheikh. Looking at the deterioration of public finance and the constraint of financing will depend on honoring the commitments made by the international community, and also that what Africa has to do in order to have access to financing, and also to countries which have complicated structures in a very competitive atmosphere. In fact, the capacity to attract external financing, and on this score, our member states are facing the obligation of having the risk of financing, and then to bring about adequate institutional reforms, where we have to banish all forms of distortion that take and assume various shapes and models of corruption, the embezzlement of public finance, fictitious and inappropriate fiscal brackets and other illicit trade and all. Without ushering in a new era of transparency and anti-corruption, the business climate will remain amorphous, gray, and not effective. You know, and better than me, that Africa is unfairly labeled as a risk area. Very often it is at the lower rung of the ladder, and this discourages external and investors, given the complex nature and the subjectivity of the issue. Your deliberation should lead us to positions that will facilitate the removal of financial constraints that in fact fetter Africa's development. On this score, on behalf of the peoples of the continent, we urge you to use after the various decisions and others that we are going to take, which are quantified. You know what an uninterrupted wave that the elites of Africa tell me, who the master of these major events, please do take some action and spare us promises, because don't try to come to me, because I'm just a messenger, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for that, those very, very quite real words to ponder, and I'm sure our governors and other decision makers are listening to you. It is now my honor to invite His Excellency Azali Assoumani, President of the Union of the Comoros and Chairperson of the African Union, for his statement.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah.
In the name of God, most merciful, most benevolent, peace and blessings be upon his prophet, his kith and kin.
Monsieur le
Excellencies, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt, my brother Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, Excellent Presidents of the Bank de China, Excellence Mustafa, Chairperson of the African Union Commission. I wanted to begin by thanking the Egyptian government for the warm welcome, generous hospitality, and also the comfortable conditions afforded to my delegation and to myself since we arrived on Egyptian soil. My thank you goes also to the African Development Bank for the perfectly organized event, an important event entitled Mobilizing Private Sector Financing for Climate and Green Growth in Africa. I am extremely pleased to take part at these annual meetings of our African Association in this beautiful city of Sharm el-Sheikh against a backdrop of difficulties in the world economy and multiplication of conflicts and also new challenges that our dear African continent has to deal with. Macroeconomic indicators are not improving in Africa in spite of our government's efforts to support vulnerable populations during this period of crisis. Average growth of African GDP has slowed from 4.8% in 2021 to 3.8% in 2022. Alongside this, 14% in 2022, in other words, the highest in Africa for over a decade. This inflation rate is due to the repercussions of the Ukraine war, the hike of food and energy prices, and also persistent difficulties in the world production chains. Our socioeconomic tissue is being impacted by this crisis, health crisis, the climate crisis, a climate of conflict in Europe and also on our continent. This risks undermining Africa's ability to honor its commitments with a view to attaining the SDGs of the United Nations and reaching out to make good on the 2063 agenda goals. I hope that this topic, focusing on mobilizing private sector financing for climate and green growth in Africa, will allow us to focus on the impact of climate change on our continent, impacts we are all aware of, This requires significant resources to support the countries most exposed, helping them to limit risks, shore up their resilience, and manage these challenges. The hike in temperature, heat waves, massive flooding, tropical cyclones, prolonged drought, and the rise in sea levels represents a loss of human life, material damage, and population displacement, undermining Africa's development. I have to say that I understand this well. I live in an island nation, a developing country that is exposed to all of these phenomena. But it is possible to transform the challenges we face into opportunities for green economic growth if we bring our private sector on board. African economy will require mobilization of existing resources and the harnessing of the potential in the private sector, and therefore it is important to encourage and to facilitate private sector investment in Africa, creating conditions that will allow for crowding in of investment, conditions such as political stability, promotion of peace, protection of property rights, strengthening of our a favorable regulatory framework, a framework that will be favorable to adequate infrastructures. Most of our countries have ratified the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is a real opportunity for our SMEs that represent around 80% of all companies in Africa, an important lever for economic growth on the continent. Thanks to the AFCFTA, companies will be able to act across Africa and help add value and promote prosperity on our continent. Furthermore, bilateral and multilateral financial institutions should also contribute to this economic growth, providing mechanisms that are innovative, that will help finance green growth. The African Union, as a member of the G20, is fundamental. We need advocacy that will lead to the African Union joining the G20 at the next summit. I would like to encourage the African Development Bank and all financial institutions to walk hand in hand with the African private sector, helping them with the resources required to promote green growth. Honourable guests, ladies and gentlemen, at the G7 summit, which has just concluded in Hiroshima, Japan, I left an appeal to the G7 countries. I asked that they listen to the AU's request for special drawing rights for Africa. Today, more than ever, we need to have more urgent financing. We need to allocate SDRs to multilateral development banks. This is the time and place, as Chairman of the African Union, to second the appeal of the UN Secretary General. We need to automatically, in times of crisis, have a special drawing right mechanism for the IMF that will allow us to channel these funds to the most needy countries, and complemented with the support of multilateral development banks. So we need hybrid capital, new structures formulated by the African Development Bank to point us in the right direction, reduce access costs. Multilateral development banks should facilitate access to capitals and help leverage the finance required for countries to go to the market. there are urgent fiscal needs. Part of the resources should therefore via the bank be channeled to help provide quality assets. Honorable guests, allow me to conclude by underscoring the importance for the continent of a resilient, climate-resilient economy, low in carbon, that will help mobilize international financial resources. It is fundamental for us to ensure that this innovative financing is used in a fair manner, in a responsible manner, so that we can all maximize the support given to the most vulnerable communities when dealing with the impacts of climate change. Thank you.